Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of the American frontier. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1885, 19 men ventured into the desolate landscape of what is now South Dakota, into a region so inhospitable that early French trappers called it les mauvaises terres, terres à traverser, the Badlands to cross. These were not naive adventurers or fortune-seekers gambling on unlikely dreams. This was a scientific expedition funded by the Smithsonian Institution, led by one of the most respected geologists in America, and equipped with everything that modern science and frontier experience deemed necessary for survival. In harsh terrain, they carried the finest surveying equipment available, ample supplies of food and water, weapons for protection, and detailed maps of the region based on previous expeditions. Yet, within 6 weeks, only 5 men would emerge from the Badlands. 14 died in circumstances that defied explanation then and continue to perplex researchers today. The survivors returned with contradictory accounts, fragmented memories, and a shared terror that never fully left them. Official reports attributed the deaths to dehydration, heat exposure, and navigational errors. But the physical evidence told a different story. A story of men who died with full canteens, who were found miles from where they should have been according to their meticulous maps, and whose bodies showed signs of trauma that no natural phenomenon could explain. What follows is a reconstruction based on expedition journals, Smithsonian archives, military reports, newspaper accounts from 1885, and testimonies given by the survivors over the following decades. Some of these documents were sealed for years, deemed too disturbing or too inexplicable for public release. Others were simply filed away and forgotten, gathering dust in basement archives until researchers decades later began piecing together what really happened in the Dakota Badlands during that terrible spring and summer of 1885. The official explanation remains exposure and poor judgment. But anyone who reads the complete record, who examines all the evidence, who listens to what the survivors said when they thought no one important was listening, knows that something else killed those men. Something that still waits in the twisted rock formations and hidden canyons of the Badlands. Something that has been there far longer than humans have walked this continent. This is the story of the Harding expedition, and why being prepared means nothing when you venture into certain places that should be left alone. Washington, D.C. in 1885 was a city transforming itself from frontier capital to modern metropolis. The Civil War had ended 20 years earlier, Reconstruction was collapsing, and America was turning its attention westward again to the vast territories waiting to be mapped, cataloged, and exploited. The Smithsonian Institution, established in 1846, was at the forefront of this scientific expansion. Its mission to increase and diffuse knowledge led to dozens of expeditions across the American West, documenting geology, paleontology, archaeology, and anthropology. The Badlands of Dakota Territory had long fascinated scientists. Early reports from fur trappers and military expeditions described a landscape like nothing else in North America. Layered rock formations in impossible colors, red and white and gold and gray, carved by wind and water into pillars, arches, and canyons that seemed almost deliberate in their strangeness. Fossils of ancient creatures emerged from the rock with every rainfall. Petrified wood lay scattered across the ground like the remains of forests that had died millennia before humans existed. It was a paleontologist's paradise and a geologist's dream. Dr. Marcus Harding was one of the Smithsonian's most accomplished geologists. At 43, he had led successful expeditions to Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana, publishing papers that advanced understanding of the region's geological history. He was methodical, cautious and respected by colleagues for his scientific rigor and his ability to keep expedition members safe in dangerous conditions. When the Smithsonian approved funding for a comprehensive geological survey of the Badlands, Harding was the obvious choice to lead it. Harding spent 6 months planning the expedition. He consulted with military officers who had passed through the region, interviewed trappers and traders who knew the territory, and studied reports from previous expeditions dating back to the 1850s. He was particularly interested in a series of observations made by a cavalry patrol in 1876. The patrol, led by a lieutenant colonel named Harrison Webb, had spent 3 days in the Badlands while pursuing a group of Lakota warriors following the Battle of Little Bighorn. Webb's official report was routine, describing terrain and movements, but his personal journal, which Harding obtained through military contacts, contained stranger observations. Webb wrote about rock formations that seemed to change position between morning and evening, though he attributed this to tricks of light and perspective. He described sounds emanating from deep canyons, low-frequency vibrations that made horses nervous and men uneasy, though he assumed these were caused by wind moving through narrow passages. Most intriguingly, he noted that the Lakota warriors his patrol was tracking had refused to enter certain areas of the Badlands, despite these areas offering excellent defensive positions. When Webb's scouts, who included Lakota guides who had surrendered earlier, were asked about this, they would only say that some places were older than the people, older than the buffalo, and that the stone remembered things that should not be disturbed. Harding, a man of science, dismissed these observations as superstition and environmental stress affecting judgment. But he noted the locations Webb had marked as avoided by the Lakota, thinking they might be geologically interesting. It was a decision that would cost 14 men their lives. The expedition assembled in Rapid City, Dakota Territory in April 1885. Harding had selected 18 men to accompany him, creating a team with diverse expertise. There was Dr. William Ashford, a paleontologist from Yale who specialized in prehistoric mammals. Dr. James Kensington, a cartographer whose maps of the Colorado Plateau were considered the finest ever produced. Frank Morrison and Thomas Bellamy, experienced frontier guides who had worked on multiple scientific expeditions. Samuel Hughes and David Porter, photographers who would document the expedition using the latest equipment. Henry Chen, a cook whose skills were legendary among expedition veterans. And 12 others, surveyors, geologists, specimen collectors, and support personnel, each chosen for specific skills that would contribute to the mission's success. They departed Rapid City on April 20, 1885, traveling by wagon across rolling prairie that gradually gave way to more broken terrain. Harding's journal from this period reflects his excitement and confidence. April 22nd, weather favorable, team working well together. Bellamy reports no concerns about route. Expected to reach Badlands proper within 3 days. Ashford already collecting interesting specimens from exposed rock layers. This promises to be most productive expedition yet. They entered the Badlands on April 25th. The landscape changed dramatically within a few miles. The prairie ended abruptly at the edge of a vast erosional system that stretched to the horizon. Before them lay a maze of buttes, pinnacles, gullies, and canyons carved from layered sedimentary rock. The colors were extraordinary, bands of rust red, bone white, charcoal gray, and gold, all sharply defined in the clear prairie light. All sharply defined in the clear prairie light. It was beautiful and alien, a landscape that seemed to belong to another planet. Harding established their base camp at the edge of the formation, at a location he called Overlook Point. From here, the expedition could see miles of Badlands stretching northward. The plan was to spend 6 weeks conducting systematic surveys, starting with easily accessible areas, and gradually moving into more remote sections. They would return to base camp every third day to resupply and organize specimens. It was a sound, conservative plan based on Harding's years of experience. The first week proceeded exactly as planned. Teams of 4 or 5 men would venture into the Badlands each morning, carefully mapping their routes, collecting specimens, and photographing formations. They returned each evening with their findings. The work was demanding, the terrain was difficult, and the heat was intense. But the team was well prepared and experienced. Harding's journals from this period are filled with geological observations and expressions of satisfaction with the expedition's progress. May 1st brought the first oddity. One of the survey teams, led by Frank Morrison, reported discovering a formation that was not on any map and did not match typical Badlands geology. Morrison described it as a perfect circle of standing stones, each approximately 6 feet tall, arranged in a clearing between 2 canyons. The stones were not sedimentary rock like the surrounding formations. They were granite, which had no business being in this location. Granite is igneous rock, formed deep underground or from volcanic activity, and there was no granite anywhere else in the Badlands. More puzzling was the arrangement. The stones were clearly placed by human hands, their spacing too regular to be natural, but the weathering patterns suggested immense age, far older than any known Native American cultures in the region. Morrison, an experienced frontiersman, was troubled by the discovery. His report to Harding noted that his team's horses refused to enter the circle, and that the men themselves felt increasingly uneasy the closer they got to the stones. Harding was intrigued. This was exactly the kind of unusual finding that made expeditions worthwhile. He organized a larger party to investigate the site the next day. 8 men, including Harding, Morrison, Ashford, and Kensington, set out at dawn on May 2nd to document the stone circle. Harding's journal describes the formation in detail. The stones were indeed granite, weathered to a smooth surface but with deep grooves carved into them. The carvings were geometric patterns, spirals, and angular designs that Harding could not match to any known culture. He made careful sketches and took measurements while Ashford examined the surrounding ground for artifacts or other evidence of human activity. What Ashford found was disturbing. In the soil within the circle, he unearthed bones, not human bones, but animal remains from species that should not have been in this location. There were bones from marine creatures, fish and sea mammals, in a region hundreds of miles from any ocean. There were bones from animals that had been extinct for thousands of years, mixed with bones from modern species. And most unsettling, there were bones that Ashford could not identify at all. Bones from creatures that did not match any known anatomy. While Ashford examined the bones, Morrison explored the canyons surrounding the circle. He discovered cave openings in the canyon walls, 3 entrances leading into darkness. Morrison was experienced with caves and understood their dangers. He would not enter without proper equipment and preparation, but he did note that air was moving out of the caves, creating a low humming sound that varied in pitch and intensity. It was, he wrote in his report, like the earth was breathing. Harding's scientific curiosity was fully engaged. He decided that the expedition would establish a secondary camp near the stone circle to allow for detailed study. Over the next 3 days, half the team moved equipment and supplies to the new location, while the other half continued routine survey work. The secondary camp was established on May 5th, and that evening, as men sat around campfires preparing their evening meal, they began to hear the sounds. It started as a low hum, barely audible, coming from the direction of the stone circle and the caves. As darkness fell, the sound intensified and changed. Sometimes it sounded like wind, though the air was still. Sometimes it sounded like distant voices, though no words could be distinguished. Several men reported feeling vibrations underfoot, as if something massive was moving beneath the ground. The horses became agitated, pulling at their restraints and showing signs of panic. Henry Chen, the expedition's cook, was the first to voice what others were thinking but hesitant to say. He told Morrison that the sounds reminded him of stories his grandmother had told him. Stories from China about places where the earth was thin, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was permeable. Morrison, usually skeptical of such things, found himself unable to dismiss Chen's concerns. There was something profoundly wrong about this place. Harding, committed to scientific investigation, refused to abandon the site based on unexplained sounds and nervous feelings. He theorized that the sounds were caused by wind moving through underground passages, creating acoustic effects similar to those found in some cave systems. The vibrations could be explained by subtle ground movements, possibly related to underground water flow or settling of geological formations. He recorded these phenomena in his journal as interesting subjects for study, not as warnings to leave. On May 6th, Harding led a team into one of the caves, taking Morrison, Ashford, and 2 assistants named Robert Clark and James Whitmore. He entered the widest cave opening, carrying lanterns, rope, and surveying equipment. They descended carefully, mapping the passage as they went. The cave was not natural. The walls showed tool marks, evidence that someone or something had enlarged and shaped the passages. The marks were old, worn smooth by time, but unmistakable. After descending approximately 200 feet, the passage opened into a large chamber. Harding estimated it was roughly 60 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond their lantern light. The walls of the chamber were covered with the same spiral and angular carvings they had seen on the stones above. But here the carvings were more elaborate, forming patterns that seemed to shift and flow when viewed from different angles. In the center of the chamber was a pit. The opening was about 10 feet across, perfectly circular, descending straight down into darkness. When they dropped stones into the pit, they counted 5 seconds before hearing impacts. Assuming a rough calculation of falling speed, that suggested the pit descended at least 400 feet, possibly much deeper. And from the pit came the humming they had heard above ground, louder here, a deep resonance that they could feel in their bones. Ashford, examining the walls near the pit, made a discovery that changed everything. Buried in the rock, visible where erosion had exposed it, was a fossil, but it was like no fossil he had ever seen. The creature was massive, based on the partial skeleton visible in the rock face. It had characteristics of a reptile, but also features that did not match any known species. Most disturbing were what appeared to be appendages that could not be explained by any evolutionary model Ashford was familiar with. While Ashford examined the fossil, Morrison explored the far side of the chamber. He found an opening, a passage leading deeper into the earth. Unlike the other passages, this one showed no tool marks. It was perfectly smooth, as if bored through the rock by some process that left no trace of its method. Morrison approached the opening and immediately stepped back. The air coming from that passage was cold, far colder than it should have been at this depth, and it carried an odor he could not place. Not decay, not any natural smell, but something that made his primitive survival instincts scream warnings. Morrison reported his findings to Harding, strongly recommending they leave the cave immediately. Harding, still focused on scientific documentation, wanted to explore further. An argument ensued, the first serious disagreement of the expedition. Morrison, normally deferential to academic authority, was adamant. They needed to leave the cave now. Harding, feeling his authority challenged, prepared to continue alone if necessary. It was Ashford who broke the impasse. The paleontologist, who had been quietly studying the fossil while the others argued, spoke up in a voice that was uncharacteristically shaken. He said they needed to leave not because of superstition or fear, but because this fossil, if his preliminary analysis was correct, was impossible. The rock layer it was embedded in was dated to approximately 75 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous period. But the creature in the rock showed characteristics that suggested intelligence, tool use, and social organization. If his analysis was correct, and he stressed that more study was needed to be certain, then something intelligent had existed on this continent long before any mammal had evolved, let alone humans. The implications were staggering. Either Ashford was misinterpreting the fossil, which he acknowledged was possible, or they had discovered evidence that would overturn every understanding of evolutionary history. Either way, they needed to retreat, document their findings carefully, and return with additional experts and equipment. Harding, faced with Ashford's reasoning, agreed to retreat, but as they prepared to leave, climbing back up toward the entrance, they heard new sounds from deeper in the cave system. Not the hum they had heard before, but something else. Movement. Something large, moving through passages toward the chamber they were leaving. They did not wait to see what approached. They climbed as quickly as safety allowed, reached the surface, and immediately sealed the cave entrance with rocks and timber. Harding rationalized this as preventing accidents, keeping other team members from entering without proper preparation. But Morrison later admitted that they sealed the entrance because they were terrified of what might come out of those caves. That night, May 6th, the sounds around camp were worse than before. The humming became a roar at times, shaking the ground beneath their tents. Men reported seeing lights moving in the Badlands, pale glows that appeared in the distance, moved in patterns that suggested intelligence, and then vanished. Some claimed to see figures standing among the rock formations, tall and thin, watching the camp. When lanterns were turned toward these figures, nothing was visible. But many men reported the sensation of being observed, studied, evaluated. Dr. Kensington, the cartographer, made a troubling discovery when reviewing his maps. The landmarks he had carefully documented over the past week did not match current observations. Formations he had sketched and measured appeared to be in different locations. Distances between notable features had changed. Kensington was an expert. His maps were used by the military and by other expeditions without complaint. The discrepancies were not mistakes or errors in judgment. The landscape itself had changed, or appeared to have changed, in ways that violated every principle of geology and physics. Harding called a meeting of the senior expedition members. Morrison and Bellamy, the guides, argued for immediate evacuation. They had both worked in challenging environments, had faced dangers from weather, wildlife, and terrain, but they had never experienced anything like this. Ashford supported evacuation, though he desperately wanted to study the fossil more thoroughly. Kensington, usually the most rational and measured member of the team, said simply that his maps no longer matched the territory, which meant they could not navigate reliably, which meant they were in mortal danger. Harding was torn. As expedition leader, he was responsible for the safety of his men. But as a scientist, he was confronted with discoveries that could transform understanding of natural history. The fossil alone, if properly documented and verified, would make his career in advanced knowledge significantly. He proposed a compromise. They would break camp and move back to Overlook Point, the original base camp. From there, they would organize a smaller volunteer team to return for additional documentation before leaving the Badlands entirely. This decision, documented in Harding's journal entry for May 7th, sealed the fate of 14 men. The expedition broke camp on the morning of May 8th and began the trek back to Overlook Point. According to Kensington's maps and Morrison's experience, the journey should have taken less than a day. They would reach base camp by late afternoon, well before dark. But by noon it was clear something was wrong. Landmarks were missing or in wrong locations. Canyons they had passed through days earlier were not where they should be. After 4 hours of travel, Morrison admitted they were lost. Lost in the Badlands is particularly dangerous because the terrain all looks similar. Layered rock formations, twisting canyons, and sharp ridges create a maze where orientation is difficult even with good maps. Without reliable maps, and with landmarks seemingly shifting, the expedition had no way to navigate effectively. Harding made the decision to stop and establish a temporary camp. They would wait out the day, get their bearings, and attempt to reach Overlook Point the next morning. As they set up camp in a small canyon, several men reported hearing voices, not the hums and strange sounds they had heard before, but actual human voices calling from the rock formations around them. The voices spoke in English, calling out names. Each man heard his own name called in a familiar voice. A parent, a sibling, a deceased friend or family member. David Porter, one of the photographers, insisted he heard his dead wife calling to him from a narrow side canyon. He tried to follow the voice. Morrison and Bellamy had to physically restrain him. That night was the worst yet. The sounds surrounded them, voices calling, lights moving in the darkness, and the ground shaking with vibrations that were too regular to be natural. Several horses broke their restraints and fled into the darkness. They were never seen again. Men huddled in their tents trying to block out the sounds, trying to maintain their sanity in the face of phenomena that made no sense. At some point during the night, Samuel Hughes disappeared. Hughes had been sleeping in a tent with Porter and another photographer. Porter swore that he had been awake, that he had been watching the tent entrance, and that Hughes had not left. Yet when dawn came, Hughes was gone. A search of the immediate area found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of where Hughes had gone. He had simply ceased to be there. The disappearance shattered what remained of group cohesion. Several men demanded immediate evacuation, arguing that they should split into small groups and each try to find their own way out. Harding refused, understanding that splitting up would be fatal. They would stay together, move carefully, and find their way back to civilization as a unit. But his authority was eroding. Men were no longer looking to him for leadership. They were looking to Morrison and Bellamy, the frontier guides who understood survival in hostile environments. May 9th began the desperate exodus. 19 men, minus Hughes, began moving south by compass direction, hoping to eventually hit the prairie that bordered the Badlands. But the Badlands seemed to resist their departure. Canyons that should have been passable were blocked by rockfalls. Routes that looked promising led to dead ends. The sun, which should have been a reliable indicator of direction, seemed to move across the sky at odd angles, creating shadows that pointed in impossible directions. By afternoon, they had made perhaps 5 miles of actual progress, though they had walked 3 times that distance. Men were exhausted, water supplies were depleting faster than planned, and morale was collapsing. Dr. James Kensington, examining his compass, discovered that it was spinning, the needle rotating without settling on any direction. He tried his backup compass. Same result. Magnetic fields in the area were disrupted to the point that compasses were useless. That night, May 9th, 3 more men disappeared. Dr. William Ashford, Robert Clark, and James Whitmore. All 3 had been sleeping near each other. All 3 vanished without anyone hearing or seeing anything. The remaining 16 men were now on the edge of panic. Several were weeping openly. Others sat staring at nothing, their minds shutting down to protect them from impossible reality. Morrison took command. Harding, still the official expedition leader, had retreated into himself, barely speaking, constantly consulting his journals as if written words could explain what was happening. Morrison told the remaining men that they would move at first light, would move fast, and would not stop for anything. If they encountered something, whatever was taking the men, they would fight or run or do whatever was necessary, but they would keep moving. Survival was the only goal now. Science and discovery were forgotten. Nothing mattered except reaching civilization alive. The exodus continued for 6 more days. Each day was a nightmare of difficult terrain, dwindling supplies, and the constant sense that they were being herded. Pushed in directions they did not choose, guided by forces they could not see, toward destinations they did not select. Each night brought new disappearances. 2 men on May 10th, 1 on May 11th, 3 on May 12th. The pattern was consistent. Men would be there one moment, gone the next, with no sound, no struggle, no explanation. By May 15th, only 7 men remained of the original 19. Marcus Harding, Frank Morrison, Thomas Bellamy, Henry Chen, David Porter, and 2 assistants whose names appear in records as J. Whitman and C. Dubois. These 7 had somehow survived where 12 others had been taken. They were dehydrated, sunburned, and on the edge of psychological collapse. But they were still moving, still trying to escape the Badlands that seemed determined to keep them. On the afternoon of May 15th, they reached the edge of the formation. After weeks of twisted rock and impossible terrain, they suddenly emerged onto flat prairie. The transition was abrupt, a clear boundary between the Badlands and the grassland beyond. They literally fell to their knees, weeping with relief, not quite believing they had escaped. But they had not all escaped. As they gathered themselves for the final push towards civilization, they realized that 2 more men were missing. J. Whitman and C. Dubois were gone. No one could say when they had disappeared. Somewhere in the final miles, in the final desperate push to freedom, 2 more men had been taken. Only 5 of the 19 who had entered the Badlands emerged alive. The 5 survivors reached a cattle ranch 2 days later. They were found wandering in open prairie, severely dehydrated and incoherent. The rancher, a man named Carl Jensen, took them in and provided water, food, and a place to rest. When they had recovered enough to speak, their stories were fragmentary and contradictory. Morrison claimed they had been hunted by something in the rock formations. Chen insisted that the land itself was alive and angry at their presence. Porter said nothing coherent, just repeated phrases about voices calling from stone and lights that moved with purpose. Harding, when he was finally able to communicate, provided the most complete account. He described the stone circle, the caves, the impossible fossil, the strange sounds, and the gradual realization that they had ventured into a place where normal laws of nature did not apply. He spoke of men disappearing as if erased from reality, of landscapes that changed when not directly observed, of an intelligence vast and ancient that had studied them and found them wanting. Word of the disaster reached the Smithsonian within a week. The institution's response was immediate and defensive. An official inquiry was launched, not to investigate what had killed the men, but to determine if Harding had been negligent in his leadership. The preliminary report, completed in June 1885, concluded that inadequate preparation, poor decision-making, and environmental stresses had caused the tragedy. Harding was relieved of his position, though allowed to resign rather than be terminated. The expedition was declared a failure. The specimens and data that had been collected, including Harding's journals and Kensington's maps, were sealed in the Smithsonian archives. No attempt was made to recover the bodies of the missing men. No follow-up expedition was organized. The Smithsonian simply closed the file and moved on to other projects. The official stance was that 14 men had died due to exposure and navigational errors in difficult terrain. The true nature of what had happened in the Badlands was buried under paperwork and bureaucratic language. But the story did not end there. Over the following years, disturbing reports emerged from the region. Cattle ranchers whose properties bordered the Badlands reported livestock going missing, not killed by predators, but simply vanishing. Travelers who ventured into the formation sometimes did not emerge. Those who did emerge spoke of voices calling from the rocks, of lights moving in the darkness, of the sensation of being watched by something vast and patient. Most significantly, a military expedition in 1889, tasked with creating updated maps of the Dakota Territory, sent a small survey team into the Badlands. The team discovered Harding's secondary camp. The site was exactly as the expedition had left it 4 years earlier. Tents still standing, equipment lying where it had been abandoned, even personal items left behind in the hasty departure. But there were no human remains, no signs of the 14 men who had disappeared. And in the center of the camp, where no structure had existed before, there was a stone, a single granite pillar, approximately 6 feet tall, with fresh carvings that matched the patterns Harding had documented in his journals. The military team retreated immediately and recommended that the area be designated off-limits for future operations. The recommendation was implemented quietly. The Badlands were marked on military maps as hazardous terrain unsuitable for travel. This designation remained in place for decades. Marcus Harding never recovered from the expedition. He was found dead in his Washington, D.C. apartment in 1887, 2 years after the disaster. The official cause was laudanum overdose, likely suicide. Among his possessions were hundreds of pages of notes, obsessive attempts to explain what had happened in the Badlands using scientific frameworks that could not accommodate the reality he had experienced. In his final writings, Harding abandoned scientific language entirely. He wrote about ancient intelligences, about beings that existed before humans and would exist after, about places where the boundary between dimensions was thin enough to cross. He wrote that the expedition had been observed from the moment they entered the Badlands, that they had been studied and tested, and that only those deemed most resilient were allowed to leave. Frank Morrison and Thomas Bellamy, the frontier guides, both left the Dakota Territory immediately after the expedition. Morrison settled in Oregon, working as a logger and refusing to discuss the Badlands. He died in 1902 in a logging accident, but his widow later reported that he had nightmares every night for 17 years, dreams of stone circles and voices calling from darkness. Bellamy went further west to California, where he worked on ranches until his death in 1908. He told his family only once about the Badlands, saying that some places are not meant for humans, that the land has its own purposes and will protect itself from intrusion. Henry Chen returned to San Francisco and never ventured into wilderness again. He spent his remaining years working in his family's restaurant, serving customers and living a deliberately mundane life. When asked about his time with the Harding expedition, he would say only that his grandmother had been right about thin places in the earth. He died in 1912, but not before writing a letter to his nephew warning him never to enter the Badlands, never to dismiss indigenous warnings about sacred or forbidden places, and never to assume that science could explain everything. David Porter, the photographer who had lost his wife and then heard her voice calling from the Badlands, was institutionalized in 1886. He spent the rest of his life in an asylum in Maryland, never fully recovering his sanity. He claimed that he still heard the voices, that they had followed him out of the Badlands, that they called to him every night. His doctors diagnosed this as trauma-induced psychosis, but the night staff at the asylum reported that sometimes, when Porter claimed to hear the voices, others heard them too. Faint calls coming from nowhere, voices that seemed to move through walls, speaking names of people both living and dead. The fifth survivor, whose name is recorded only as T. Sullivan in expedition records, disappeared in 1890. He had been working as a surveyor in Wyoming when he simply vanished one night from a boarding house. His room was locked from the inside, his possessions untouched, but Sullivan was gone. The only unusual detail was a fine layer of dust on the floor, a reddish-gray dust that chemical analysis identified as coming from the Badlands of Dakota, over 300 miles away. In the decades following the disaster, researchers and historians occasionally attempted to investigate the Harding expedition more thoroughly. Access to the sealed Smithsonian files was difficult, but not impossible. Those who did gain access found that critical documents were missing or heavily redacted. Harding's complete journals existed, but sections had been physically removed, pages cut out with what appeared to be great care. Kensington's maps were present, but many showed alterations, features that had been erased or drawn over, as if someone wanted to obscure certain locations. Most intriguing were the photographs. Samuel Hughes and David Porter had taken numerous images during the expedition before Hughes disappeared. These photographs should have been in the Smithsonian archives. Many were, but some negatives showed strange artifacts, unexplained areas of light or shadow that could not be attributed to developing errors or camera malfunction. A few photographs showed figures in the background, tall and thin, standing among the rock formations. These figures had not been visible to the photographers when the images were taken. They appeared only in the developed photographs, as if they existed in a spectrum of light that human eyes could not perceive, but that photographic emulsion could capture. The Smithsonian's official position was that these photographic anomalies were defects in the early photographic process, but privately, curators noted that similar anomalies appeared in photographs taken by other expeditions to the Badlands, both before and after the Harding disaster. There was a pattern, a consistency to these artifacts that suggested they were not random defects but captures of something real. In 1936, a professor of geology from the University of Chicago named Dr. Eleanor Vance obtained permission to conduct limited research in the Badlands. She was specifically interested in the stone circles that Harding had documented, wondering if they might be evidence of pre-Columbian cultures more advanced than currently understood. Dr. Vance was a serious scholar, skeptical of supernatural explanations, committed to rational investigation. She entered the Badlands in June 1936 with 2 graduate students and a guide. They carried maps based on Harding's journals, seeking the location of the secondary camp and the stone circle. They found the camp easily enough. It had mostly collapsed over 50 years, but the site was recognizable, and near the camp, they found the stone circle. Exactly as described, granite pillars with weathered carvings standing in impossible arrangement. Dr. Vance spent 3 days documenting the site. She photographed the stones from every angle, made sketches of the carvings, took soil samples, and examined the surrounding area for any additional evidence. Her notes from this period are professional and detailed, showing none of the fear or unease that had characterized previous accounts. She theorized that the stones were indeed pre-Columbian, possibly erected by a culture that had been displaced or destroyed before European contact. The carvings, she thought, might be astronomical markers or religious symbols. On the 4th day, Dr. Vance and her team explored the caves that Harding had entered in 1885. The entrance Harding had sealed was no longer blocked, the rocks and timber having been removed or decayed over decades. They descended carefully with modern equipment and electric lanterns. They found the chamber Harding had described, though Dr. Vance noted that its dimensions seemed larger than Harding's measurements suggested. The pit in the center was still there, still emanating that low humming sound. Dr. Vance examined the walls and found the fossil that had so disturbed Ashford. She was trained in paleontology as well as geology, and her analysis confirmed Ashford's concerns. The creature in the rock was unlike anything in the known fossil record. Its morphology suggested intelligence, perhaps even civilization, yet it existed in rock layers that predated any known intelligent species by tens of millions of years. While Dr. Vance studied the fossil, one of her graduate students, a young man named Robert Hayes, explored the smooth passage that Morrison had discovered. Hayes entered the passage despite Dr. Vance's instructions to wait. He walked approximately 50 feet into the darkness before his lantern began to fail. As the light dimmed, Hayes reported seeing something ahead of him in the passage. Something large and tall, standing motionless, watching him. Hayes fled back to the chamber, and the team immediately retreated to the surface. That night, camped near the stone circle, Dr. Vance's team experienced the same phenomena that had terrified the Harding expedition. Voices calling from the rocks. Lights moving in the darkness. Ground vibrations that suggested massive movements beneath the earth. Dr. Vance, trained to seek rational explanations, attempted to document these phenomena scientifically. She took measurements, recorded observations, tried to maintain professional detachment. But even she admitted in her notes that the experience was profoundly unsettling, that something about the Badlands made conventional scientific analysis seem inadequate. They left the Badlands the next morning, cutting their planned week-long research trip short after just 5 days. Dr. Vance returned to Chicago, analyzed her findings, and prepared a paper on the stone circle and the fossil. The paper was rejected by every journal she submitted to. Peer reviewers questioned her methodology, her conclusions, and in some cases her sanity. The consensus was that Dr. Vance had made errors in her fossil analysis, that the stone circle was a natural formation misinterpreted as artificial, and that any strange experiences during the trip could be explained by environmental stress and isolation. Dr. Vance never returned to the Badlands. She continued her career in geology, publishing respected work on other topics, but she never again discussed her findings from 1936 in public. Privately, she told colleagues that some questions were better left unanswered, that some places preserved mysteries that human science was not equipped to solve, and that the indigenous peoples who called certain areas sacred or forbidden were often right to do so. The stone circle still stands in the Badlands. The caves still descend into darkness beneath the layered rock formations. And every few years, someone disappears in that region, vanishing without trace or explanation. Hikers, tourists, researchers, all drawn by the strange beauty of the Badlands or by curiosity about the old stories. Most who enter emerge safely, experiencing nothing more unusual than difficult terrain and extreme weather. But some do not emerge at all, and some emerge changed. Speaking of voices that called their names, of lights that moved with intelligence, of the sensation of being watched by something vast and ancient that has been waiting in those rocks for longer than humans have existed. The official explanation remains unchanged. Deaths in the Badlands are attributed to exposure, dehydration, falls, or getting lost in difficult terrain, which is true in a literal sense. But it does not explain why experienced outdoors people, equipped with modern GPS technology and ample supplies, sometimes vanish completely. It does not explain the photographs that occasionally surface, images taken by tourists showing unexplained figures standing among the rock formations. It does not explain why the stone circle, when located by different groups over the years, seems to be in different locations, as if the Badlands themselves rearrange to hide or reveal certain features based on criteria no human understands. In 1985, exactly 100 years after the Harding expedition, the National Park Service conducted a comprehensive survey of Badlands National Park. The survey team was professional, experienced, and well-equipped with technology that Harding could not have imagined. They spent 6 months mapping the park, documenting geological features, and updating records. Their work was thorough, and their findings were valuable for park management. But buried in their report, in an appendix that was not widely circulated, was a curious note. The survey team reported discovering multiple granite formations that should not exist in that location, standing stones arranged in patterns that appear deliberate. They also reported anomalies in their GPS equipment, instances where readings were impossible or contradictory, suggesting magnetic or gravitational disturbances that current geological models could not explain. The team recommended that certain areas of the park be designated as restricted access, not for preservation purposes but for visitor safety, though the specific nature of the safety concerns was left deliberately vague. Today, Badlands National Park receives over 1 million visitors annually. The vast majority have safe, enjoyable experiences, witnessing one of the most unique landscapes in North America. The Park Service maintains trails, provides maps and posts warnings about the usual dangers: heat, dehydration, rattlesnakes, sudden weather changes. They do not mention the other dangers, the ones that cannot be explained in rational terms, the ones that have been claiming lives since before recorded history in this region. But rangers who work in the park, particularly those who have been there for many years, know the stories. They know about the Harding expedition and the 14 men who disappeared. They know about the stone circles that appear on some maps but not others. They know about the caves that descend deeper than any surveying equipment can measure. And they know the cardinal rule that is passed down from senior rangers to new hires: if you see lights moving in the Badlands at night, do not investigate. If you hear voices calling your name from the formations, do not answer. And if you encounter standing stones arranged in circles, leave immediately and report the location. But do not under any circumstances enter the circle or attempt to touch the stones. Because the Badlands remember the ancient rock formations that were old when dinosaurs walked the earth, that witnessed the rise and fall of countless species, that will remain long after humanity is extinct. These rocks remember. They remember those who came before humans, those who carved the symbols and erected the stones and descended into the caves to worship or study or communicate with something that dwelled in the darkness beneath the earth. And they remember those who ignored the warnings, who entered unprepared or arrogant or convinced that science could explain and control everything. Marcus Harding and his expedition were not the first to learn this lesson. The Lakota warriors who refused to enter certain areas knew it already. The French trappers who named it the Badlands knew it, and countless others before them, stretching back through unrecorded history, knew it too. The Badlands are not empty. They have never been empty. Something has always dwelt there. Something patient and ancient, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. Preparation, equipment, experience, knowledge, none of these things matter when you encounter something that exists outside the framework of human understanding. Marcus Harding was one of the most prepared expedition leaders of his era. His team had the finest equipment available. They followed sound procedures and made reasonable decisions based on available information. And 14 of them died anyway, taken by something that left no traces, no evidence, no explanation that fit within the boundaries of science. So if you find yourself drawn to the Badlands, fascinated by their strange beauty and geological wonders, remember the Harding expedition. Remember that being prepared means nothing against forces you cannot understand. Remember that some places are old enough and strange enough that they operate by their own rules. Remember that warnings from indigenous peoples about forbidden or sacred places are based on millennia of accumulated wisdom and should not be dismissed as primitive superstition. And remember, above all, that if you see standing stones in a circle, if you hear humming coming from deep beneath the ground, if you discover caves that descend into darkness beyond your light, you should turn around immediately and leave. Because in those places, something is always watching. Something is always waiting. something that was ancient when humanity was young, and will be ancient still when humanity is gone. Something that collects those who venture too far, who ask too many questions, who touch things that should not be touched. Do not go unprepared into the Dakota Badlands, but understand that no amount of preparation will protect you if you go too far. If you enter the wrong places, if you attract the attention of what dwells in those layered rocks. Marcus Harding learned this lesson. 14 men died learning this lesson. And every few years, someone else enters the Badlands convinced that modern knowledge and equipment will keep them safe. And they learn the same lesson that has been taught for thousands of years. Some places are not meant for humans. Some questions should not be asked. And some warnings should be heeded, no matter how prepared you think you are.